Hi there. Today I'd like to talk about the difference between SSDs and hard drives. Basically, a hard drive is a mechanical device that stores data on spinning platters that are read by a read-write head. And there's a lot that can go wrong there. The most notable thing is like a head crash or similar issues with the head. Also, the data can be altered by magnets on the spinning platters, as it's actually changing magnetic fields that represent the data, the ones and zeros on the drive. So there's quite a bit that can go wrong. Generally, the most common failure is in a laptop. Vibration or shock will cause something inside the drive to go out of alignment. There's also, just age. Hard drives don't last as long as SSDs. Now that transitions to what is an SSD. So an SSD is essentially a solid-state device. A solid-state disk is actually what SSD stands for. And an SSD basically stores data on NAND memory chips. So it's all solid-state. There's no moving parts. There's no mechanical parts. Everything's read by a flash memory controller. A dramatic oversimplification of it would be essentially that it's a large volume of solid-state storage like a flash drive, like a USB flash drive. Now, there are obviously some advantages and disadvantages to both, so let's get into those. So I guess the first thing to talk about before we really get into the details of SSDs and hard drives and their advantages and disadvantages, let's talk about some of the form factors that are out there. So for mechanical hard drives, of course, they've been around for a long time, and there are some very small drives out there. I think back in 2004, maybe it was Sony or Toshiba introduced a 0.85 inch hard drive. Very small, like, tiny little thing. And there have also been, sub 2.5 inch hard drives like used in the old iPods. There have been, and some tablets, some older tablets, 2.5 inch hard drives are the most common for laptops. Some desktops will use 2.5 inch drives in the case of maybe a small desktop, but that also kind of brings you up into SSD territory. So a lot of SSDs are 2.5 inch SATA SSDs. Another common form factor is the 3.5 inch drive. 3.5 inch drives are generally hard drives, and floppy drives were also 3.5 inch. If you had an internal zip disk back in the day, that was 3.5 inch, most likely. There's also the 5.25 inch form factor, CD drives, DVD drives, some zip drives maybe, things like that. Sometimes if you would have a caddy that your hard drive was installed in, that was 5.25 inch, but that's kind of irrelevant. That's getting into, and there were large hard drives that were that size, the Bigfoot series. But that's kind of getting into stuff that's irrelevant to this conversation. So the other form factor I should probably mention is NVMe, M.2, and M.2 SATA. Those are all kind of these little gum stick, or just they're very thin, and they are generally installed into a socket on the motherboard or logic board of a computer. They're often used in laptops and increasingly in desktops. In fact, I think these days the most common SSD is probably going to be an NVMe or M.2 SSD, but that's kind of the general overview of form factors. With that, let's move on to the actual comparison. So there's a few factors I'd like to compare. They include speed, longevity, durability, price, power consumption, and I have a few other notes on them as well. The first thing, speed. SSDs are a lot faster than hard drives because they don't have to physically seek. Seeking is the process of going around the circle and waiting for the data to come around. You don't have to wait for that. And you also don't have to just wait for any of those mechanical operations in general to occur. You don't have to wait for the drive to spin up. They're much faster. And that's probably going to be the biggest reason that people want to switch to SSDs. They're definitely a lot better for reading large amounts of data quickly as boot drives, system drives, even for games. But they're not as good if you're writing data, and that kind of leads into longevity. There's significantly more write cycles available or erase and write cycles available on a hard drive than there are on an SSD. So as far as longevity is concerned, SSDs don't last anywhere near as long as hard drives. Now, there's kind of two sides to that, because you have to also consider durability. SSDs are so much more durable and they are so much more reliable that overrides a lot of the longevity argument, unless you're talking about a server or a large amount of data being stored. In the case of a large amount of data being stored, because of the cost, see, these things all kind of go together, it's probably worth buying 2 or more large hard drives and just keeping the data synchronized between them, or running them in a RAID array or something similar, rather than purchasing a large SSD at a significantly higher cost, writing it to death, and then having a destroyed drive. Technically speaking, the longevity of a hard drive is greater than that of an SSD. Hard drives will handle a lot more erase and write cycles than an SSD will. Now, mean time between failures, SSDs are a lot more reliable. Like an average hard drive would be maybe 300,000 hours mean time between failures, average time between failures, where an average SSD would be somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1.5 million hours. That's a significant difference, longevity versus MTBF. So I think most consumers, most desktop users, most laptop users are going to be focused on MTBF more than they are data longevity, because the longevity factor really only comes into play when you're talking about large amounts of storage that's being written and rewritten often, and lots of churn on the data. A server, data storage, NAS, you should use a hard drive. Desktop, workstation, laptop, definitely use an SSD. Let's talk about durability for a minute. So the durability of an SSD is on another level to that of a hard drive. Where a hard drive could fail after one large bump or shock or a significant amount of vibration over a day, SSD could withstand all of that for its entire life and not skip a beat. And they're also more or less immune to magnets due to the, again, data being stored on a hard drive is magnetic fields changing, whereas data being stored on a SSD is going to be NAND gates, which are sort of purely electrical in nature. So it's not as likely to be altered by a magnet, not anywhere near as likely. So that's a big factor when you're picking SSD versus hard drive. I think the biggest factors that everyday people are going to be thinking about are going to be the durability, the cost, and the speed. Let's talk about cost. So the price of an SSD per terabyte is going to be a significant amount higher than that of a hard drive. I think for a terabyte of SSD storage, on the cheapest SSD you can get, you're probably going to be spending around $120 to $150. I don't know today's prices, but that's just my guess, historical guess based on the last time I bought a drive. The average price of a hard drive, you might spend $40-50 on a terabyte. So they're a lot cheaper, and you can always get more of them. So if you're talking about running like a desktop computer or a server, it's not a bad idea to run hard drives as your bulk storage. The next little piece I'd like to touch on is power consumption. So SSDs are going to use significantly less power than hard drives. And that's definitely going to be something you're going to care about a lot if you're putting them in a laptop or in a small device. And your phone probably uses some form of SSD, or at least a SD card. A lot of them use what's called eMMC, which is just sort of an SD card. And some of them do use proper SSDs. Most small devices will use SSDs, and most laptops should use SSDs. If your laptop didn't come with an SSD, you should probably replace whatever is in there with an SSD. Finally, let's talk about what we generally recommend as a company. So, on my desktop, I use an SSD as my boot drive and for games and for loading most applications, and I use a hard drive, a large hard drive, or even 2, as my storage and backup. So if I'm storing a lot of media, if I'm storing a lot of pictures, videos, music. I will generally use, and ISOs and stuff, I will generally use my big hard drive. You know, like right now I have two 4 terabyte drives and they just sync. And I actually try to leave one of them off most of the time and just sync them on a regular basis, so it's kind of like a backup. But I try not to put anywhere near as many hours on the second drive, so I always have that one available in case one drive crashes. That's sort of the ultimate setup as far as having a backup and not worrying about losing data. The SSD does most of the heavy lifting as far as loading things on a daily basis, loading applications. I have a very fast and fluid experience, but I also have plenty of storage available. In a laptop, SSD, hands down. Always use an SSD in a laptop. You're going to get more durability, good speed, and it's worth paying more for that extra capacity. And it's doubtful that you're ever going to be like writing a lot to your laptop over and over and over. Most likely you're going to be writing and storing stuff on your laptop. So it's best to keep an SSD in your laptop and not use a hard drive in your laptop, because the moment that you drop your laptop one time, you just might have lost all your data. And so it's best to always be using an SSD in there. Another thing we recommend, if the drive is going to potentially get really full, just buy a bigger drive. One thing with SSDs is that they do a function called trim, and there's a few other functions where they kind of maintain themselves as opposed to a defragment on a traditional hard drive. So a trim essentially keeps the data organized in such a way where it's not destroying the drive, and it keeps data from the end of the drive. You don't want an SSD to be totally full. You want it to have space to maintain itself. Maybe 80% full should be like your absolute maximum on an SSD, and honestly you probably want to keep it lower than that, maybe 70, 60%. If you get so full, if your SSD gets completely full, replace it with a bigger SSD. Don't defragment an SSD. It's not necessary to defragment them. Generally, most modern operating systems will recommend that you don't defragment them. They'll actually display something that tells you, hey, don't bother, or optimize. It'll do it itself. The SSDs generally maintain themselves, or they have back-end software built into Windows, Mac OS, and Linux that will do it for you. So don't defragment your SSD, because what you're doing is you're actually using a bunch of those write erase cycles just to move data around, and it doesn't really need to be moved around. Now, the reason that defragmenting is important on a hard drive is that you want data to kind of be in sequence. You don't want data to be so far, like this one file. You don't want that to be so far separated that it has to seek and seek and seek and seek over and over and over again just to find pieces of this one file that you're looking for. With an SSD, the rate at which it can move around the drive and read different pieces of the drive is really unnecessary to defragment. So I think that mostly covers it. In general, just SSDs are for laptops, workstations, pretty much everything unless you are writing to the drive and storing a lot of data. Hard drives are for desktops, storing large amounts of data, servers storing large amounts of data, and we're talking large capacity, and that's something I might not have touched on here either. There are really large capacity hard drives available, whereas SSDs, you can get them in large capacity, but it gets to be extremely expensive. So that's important. If you want tens of terabytes in one drive, you can find that in a hard drive for a reasonable price. If you want tens of terabytes in a SSD, you're probably not going to find that at a reasonable price. So I hope that covers everything. Please like and comment if you like this video. Subscribe if you would. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.